As I'm working on this miniature double point knitting, as you can see, right now I'm not very far along, and my floss is all kinky because I had gotten to a certain point and I pulled it out and started again, which may happen with miniature knitting. In my case, the stitches just didn't look good, so I pulled them out and started again. But I wanted to show you a tool that you might find helpful, and you'll have to pardon the computer. It's plastic. The real nice ones are made of wrought iron, and it's a thread stand where for sewing you put a cone of thread here and then run the thread up to this hook and to your sewing machine. And I have several of them for the sewing machine, and this one's old and a little bit beat up. Like I said, they're plastic. I think I might have gotten this either at Joann.com or maybe at Annie's. Is that the name of that store, Annie's? I haven't bought things from there in a while. It could have been Clotilde. But anyway, I think I paid $3 or $4 a piece. And how I'm finding it's helpful, and let's just go like this. When I pulled the yarn out, part of my problem was that the floss was getting tangled among the needles. And what I did use a yarn ball winder just to get the floss organized. And it's just sitting here. But the fact that I'm running it up here is really helping because it's keeping the floss out of the way. And as I had said in one of my videos, I am now knitting about 6 inches off the surface of the table in a little orbit, and I can keep the floss from getting wrapped around the needles. So that's one thing that might help. The other thing I want to mention, these are number 16, an inch and a quarter long. The size is 16, an inch and a quarter long flathead nails. You could make a shirt for a 4-inch doll with those. And they're actually thicker than the needles I'm using now. That is a good concept to keep in your mind. It not only trains your hands to work small, I've actually made knitting needles out of common pins, and I can knit on common pins if I have to. I'm not bragging, it's just that if you keep it in your mind that you could knit with nails, then your concept is how small you're working. Now this is actually the box of I bought, like, because of all the other things I do, I have what's called a carton of these. I bought 12 packages, I think. So they're number 16 by inch and a quarter flathead nails. I forget what I bought them for. I've used these to make weaving looms, pin looms. I made a triangle loom, and I'm thinking I made a large, like 5-foot triangle loom. And I might have used these for the pins. I use them for a lot of things, but that may be why I bought so many of them. Anyway, I cast on about, I forget how many stitches the other day. I was up to, I think, 10 on here. And then I had to stop and do something else. So it's just something to keep in mind with miniature knitting. In the United Kingdom and in, I think, early America, knitting needles were called knitting pins. And that's because a lot of them are very narrow, like pins. And that's the delicate lace knitting, or in this case, miniature knitting. So it's the opposite spectrum from the size 15 double point needles that we started with. And I'll get this to 2.5 inches, and then we'll bind off, and I'll show you the next step. Now I'm still working on my knitting here, but perhaps if you are finding miniature knitting frustrating, I want to give you a little maybe encouragement or scare the heck out of you one way or another. This is one of my patterns. It's a bunting for a 1-inch doll. It's knit in thread with a blanket. I think that blanket is part of the pattern. And a hat, another blanket. It can either be a bunting or a christening dress. Then on this one, these are Heidi Ott clothes, except the vest is knit, and that's actually over knit in sock yarn. But you can see it fits a 4-inch doll, a 3.5-inch doll, and fits underneath the Heidi Ott clothes. And a hat. This one currently just has a hat on. I have made the hats with, you can make them with double point needles. I've made them with a 10-pin knitting loom that's about 1 inch wide that I found at Decor Accents many years ago. This is another Heidi Ott doll, and this is one of the dresses that I have a pattern for in the store. This one is knit with DMC linen floss, and that particular dress is maybe from 2009, and you can see, I mean, they hold up very well. The dolls fall over, but the clothes hold up very well. These are usually on display in a miniature dollhouse that I have. And here's the one we're working with now. And this is a sweater pattern that I have to write up. And I think I did that one in floss. This was done in acrylic crochet thread. And that's the same pattern as the Heidi Ott doll, only longer. And then there are skirts and tops. There's more dresses. And this is a pair of shorts that can also be long pants, excuse me, for the 6-inch male doll. And then I also have patterns for ponchos and hats for these dolls. So when you're doing miniature knitting, this is 1/12 scale. Once you start and you get used to it, you can make all kinds of different things. So that's the encouragement. And the fear or panic, if there is any, is that the needles become smaller and smaller and smaller. But that's kind of an idea. Now, if you're not into this, this is a wonderful book. It's called Sewing Doll Clothes, 27 Projects to Make in 1/12 Scale. And I thought the author was on the front. I guess not. It's put out by the Guild of Master Craftsmen Publications. So I guess it's put out by the Guild and not just one author. But you can see that most of these are costumes, which are wonderful if you're doing especially Victorian dollhouse items, or this is kind of a takeoff on the Queen of Hearts and Alice. But here's, I think that's either a wedding anniversary or a birthday dress. And then I think that's an Irish dancer, a shopkeeper maybe, or a wallpaper person. They have all kinds of patterns in here. Most of it I would do with hand sewing. Beautiful little costumes, but most of it I would do with hand sewing, I think. It depends on the dolls that you have. And what I was going to say is that these patterns that I've done in knitting will also fit many of the town square I was saying they will also fit the town square vinyl dolls that are 1/12 scale. So you don't have to have the Heidi Ott dolls in order to make clothes for them. So that's, right now what I'm doing is still knitting, and different from other knitting, you might find that you work on this a little bit and then walk away from it and come back later. I was saying I happen to get very busy in the past 2 days. I was saying that I happen to get very busy in the past couple of days. So this has had to wait until today for me to finish it. And I wanted to show you that I do have other patterns, because those are all fitted and there are decreases and increases and specific ways of making them. Same with this sweater. But what we're making now is very much simpler. It's kind of a cross, if it works the way I'd like it to work, it's kind of a cross between knitting and sewing. And we'll just have to see how it turns out. So I will continue knitting to 2.5 inches. Now I've been doing this with 4 needles, actually 5 needles, simply because getting used to the manipulation again. But at the same time, if you would like to use 4 needles, you can. And if you want, it's not really, it shouldn't matter too much. If you have small gaps, it shouldn't matter too much in this finished item. So if I were going to move the stitches now from needle to needle, I would have 13 on 2 needles and 14 on the 3rd needle. And that would give you a triangle, and you would use the 4th needle as your working needle. So 13, 13, and 14 on 3 needles. You can also do that from the beginning if you want, or you can do it now. Keeping it square in this particular case has been good for me because I needed to know the width in half. So as it collapses, I needed to know that. But if it's easier for you, you can just use 3 needles with stitches on it and a 4th working needle. If you'd like to make this project a short skirt, knit to overall length 1¼ inches, which is where I am now. And I did change to 3 needles with a 4th working needle. So it will be that long. Leave the ribbing at the bottom, knit, as I said, for 1¼ inches, bind off loosely. I'm just into the 2nd skein of floss. Cut about a 7-inch length of floss, weave it through the cast off stitches, and cut it, to length that you need, but use it as a drawstring to make a drawstring waist skirt for the 4-inch doll. So that's very simple. Just I'm pretty sure this was 6 rows. No, that was the last pattern I was just looking at. I'm sorry. Anyway, overall length, I have to go back and look at the beginning of the video. It's probably 3 rounds of ribbing, and I'm going further, but if you stop at 1¼ inch overall length, bind off loosely, and then use a piece of the floss to and a tapestry needle to weave it through the top of the cast off stitches, and then use it as a drawstring, you will have a short skirt for the 4-inch doll. Okay, I have finished knitting to 2½ inches, and my stitches aren't perfect, but switching to 3 needles in the middle of it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference. Now there are a few things you can do with this, and in one of my other videos I had mentioned that there are many uses for circular knitting and tubes that you might not think about. Now, with casting on the 3 rows, casting on 40 stitches, knitting 3 rows of knit 2, purl 2, and then knitting to 1.5 inches, you could then bind off, and you would have had an edge like this, and you could run a piece of floss with all 6 strands in and out of the rows around the top and make a drawstring. So there would have been a short skirt on the doll. This, you can do the exact same thing at 2.5 inches and have a long skirt on the doll. Like that. Now, what I'm going to do is a little bit different. She needs pants. And as you saw, I have a pants pattern for a size 6-inch male doll, but I have to redo the sizing and everything in order for it to fit her. Now, I took her sweater off. At some point I have to make her a top, but this is how the dolls are made. They're these are high quality plastic, and so they're part plastic, part stuffing, part wiring. And I had to get some pants on her quickly. She has Heidi Ott clothes, but because they tend to be used dolls, the clothes get ruined. So I had even stitched these on her, excuse me, just to get some pants on her. The stuffing on the legs, this is the teen doll, supposedly, the 4-inch tall doll, and the stuffing goes to about here, and then she has lower plastic legs. Now, what I just did, or am doing, is I'm turning the tube inside out. And any loose threads I ended up with, because sometimes you knit 5 strands instead of 6, I pulled those through to the other side already. This is what I'm going to do, is I'm turning this inside out. The ribbing is actually going to be at the waist. And I'm sorry I'm doing this with one hand and holding the camera. So here it is inside out with all the purl stitches. And the ribbing is going to be the waistband, and I'm going to run embroidery floss through this to make a drawstring waist. You could use, if you can find 1/8 inch or narrower ribbon, you could run a ribbon through the top and it would look more like a belt. There are a couple of other ideas I have for this, but before I get to those other ideas, this is what I'm going to try. What I want to do is, those are the pants right there. I'm going to take a sewing machine, and this comes in from Norwegian sweater knitting, where they'll knit something like this in a tube and then stitch 2 lines, not through the whole thing, but they'll stitch 2 lines down one side and then cut it, and it becomes a cardigan. Now I'm going to do something similar to that, except I'm going to find the center of the fabric. I am going to mark down the center in chalk. I'm using a needle to show you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch with a machine, a lock stitch machine. I'm going to stitch about 1/4 inch across the top of where the needle is and stitch down the center, and then I'm going to stitch about 1/8 inch on either side of where you see the needle. In effect, using the fabric as fabric, and these obviously will be the top of the pants to where the needle is. And by putting this in the center first, I then have a guide mark to go 1/8 of an inch on either side. Now, I need a lock stitch machine, and the gauge on this has turned out to be about, it's 20 rows per inch and 15 stitches per inch. So that's a very small gauge. And my lock stitch machine needs to be set on at least 20 stitches per inch. My little Spartan here will do 30 stitches per inch. And I'm thinking that I need that many, that high of a stitch count on the sewing machine, because if you look at these, I had sewn these normally. I made them a little small, and that's not stay stitching. That was the way I had sewn them, and it all started to fray and come apart. So I'm going to need at least 20 stitches per inch on the sewing machine. Now what I'm afraid of, because I haven't done this one before, I'm not worried about the top and the waistband and the drawstring. You can see if I just stitch down the middle here, the knitting is going, and then 1/8 of an inch in, the knitting is going to have to stretch to fit her. So if I had done any less than 40 stitches, I wouldn't even be able to think about this. So the first thing to do is mark that center line, and I'm going to take a needle and actually stick it through the fabric. Okay, so there's the fabric, and oops, I'm using just chalkboard chalk. And now I have to remember that it's more toward the right of that mark. But there's my center. And that's how high I can go. So in effect, now that I have that marked, and because the chalk was so wide, I could even take the sewing machine and go up one side, across here, and then down the other side. And voila, we should have a pair of pants. Now, if that works, and when you do that, you would obviously be sewing through both layers. But if that works, then another item that can be added to this that I'm not going to do today, but that you could do, is when you pick up and knit, we would be, if I were going to do that, we would pick up from the ribbing. You stick a needle through the top edge of the stitch, and that's called picking up. And then you start a new working yarn on another needle, and you knit it. And that's how you start. But usually it's easier, like say I had to pick up 5 stitches here. Well, there's 3. It's easier to pick up all 3 or 5 or whatever at once and then knit them. That can be difficult to do, especially through the ribbing. But if I did do that, I could then knit about 3/4 of an inch, and she would have overalls. And from the top of the bib part, I could pick up just 2 stitches on either side of the bib and knit straps, and then just stitch them to the back. So, and that's all from a tube. So a short skirt, a long skirt, a pair of pants, a pair of overalls, all from casting on 40 stitches on 00 knitting needles and 3 rows of ribbing, and knit for 2.5 inches. And then the other ways you can use it I've just explained. So now what I'm going to do, because I have to be very accurate about this, I'm going to plug in my old Spartan and see if I can, now that I see the way the chalk marked and how that's going to fit her legs, I think I am going to try and just go up and down. I'm going to have to try to do it twice, and the hard part is going to be trimming the fabric when I cut it in the middle to give her two legs. The reason I need the high stitch count is so that all of this doesn't start to fray. I could put fray check on it if it does, but I'd rather not do that. I'd rather these were usable where they could go on and off. So I'm going to go ahead and sew them, and I'll show you what they look like when I'm done. Now there isn't a light on this Spartan, but I think you can see okay. I had put a new motor on this machine, and it has a foot pedal that I'm not really crazy about. It goes very fast. So what I'm going to do before I do this very delicate stitching, I'm going to set the machine at 30 stitches. And the Spartan's a very simple machine. It does have a back tack, but it's not a full reverse. But let's just see how it goes. See how it just takes off? So I'm not real crazy about the foot pedal. I was going to use one of my hand cranks for this, but I don't think that one goes to 30 stitches. And I actually have a black bobbin thread in there. I never ever sew at 30 stitches. Look at how many stitches are there. That is a lot of stitches, and the bobbin thread is actually pulling up, but that is because that's just 2 layers of muslin. So let's try it again. I guess it'll work all right. I'm just afraid that I'm going to take off with the machine and ruin my knitting. So let's get this out of here. I think as I use this machine more, the foot pedal will loosen up a little bit. It's just almost an on-off kind of thing. And I don't know how it's going to go through the knitting. I did loosen the tension just a little bit. And I may have a problem with the knitting moving over the feed dogs. Isn't that funny? I wonder what slips when it does that. Maybe I have the belt too loose. I have the belt pretty loose. See, I put the motor on a while ago, and I bet the belt has loosened up a little bit. I'm actually trying to do it narrower than the chalk so that when I cut it, I'm leaving quite a bit on the inside. That worked, so far that worked better than I expected. Now I'm going to go over it again because, as I said, when I made those other pants, which were a fairly tightly woven cotton, they started to fall apart. Now this, I have to leave it as wide on the leg section as I can and do this second row on the inside. So it's almost like I'm going to need a craft knife to cut the center. At least now I know I have to tighten the belt. Okay. I'm just trying to make sure that's secure enough before I go ahead and cut it. Now at 15 stitches per inch, left to right, that will give it some give, you know, over a woven fabric. This is the scary part, cutting it. Here we go. We'll see what happens. Imagine they do this to sweaters all the time. Some people do. And I'm going to leave that and not go all the way up to the stitching. Let's turn them inside out and put them on her and see if they work. If this works, when I do a knitting pattern for fitted pants, like the shorts for the 6-inch male doll, there's a lot of work involved, and not in the knitting so much as, well, let's just put it that it's more like an actual garment pattern. But if I can just knit tubes and then turn them inside out and have pants, it's easier. So let me shut the camera off, and I can't get the legs through there. I just have to poke them through with a pencil or something, and we'll put them on her. Now this is, usually with small doll clothes, it's a little bit difficult to get their feet through. It looks like they'll fit her. It looks like it worked. The knitting and the stitching is holding, and that's what I cared about. So I had that set on 30 stitches an inch. I haven't checked I have a brother sewing machine that's more modern, and I didn't check it to see how many stitches per inch it will do. I think most of them do 20. So let me just pull these up. Normally in the crotch area here, I would be clipping the curves. And what I did instead was just cut a couple of individual stitches. Now these, I have to cut those other orange pants off of her. But once I get the orange pants off of her, which are making it thick, and I run a drawstring through the waist, she has a pair of pants. So that worked, which I'm thrilled with. I may not even have to take those orange pants off. I probably will though, because in a couple of areas right here I'm seeing a little bit of white thread. So I'll probably take these back off of her and cut the orange pants off of her, but in the meantime I'm going to just run. This is about 18 inches of floss, and it's all that was left out of the 2 skeins of floss. So to make these pants took 2 skeins of DMC floss, and they're 8 yards a piece, I believe, so 16 yards of DMC floss to make these. This needle's a little big, but I just want to go through the larger stitches if I can. Run this through. The needle's too big. So let me find another needle, take the orange pants off, and fit them on her correctly. That's a better view of what the body shape actually is on these dolls, and I had to use quite a small tapestry needle. So let's get these back on her. I will be thrilled if this works, because even though the knitting is so small, I've been using a workspace here. Looks like I've got an extra loop there. But you can be portable with it. I think that I'm just trying to figure out what this big loop is here. But let me get these on her. I think I'll have to redo that. Especially it's faster when you're on 3 needles and using a 4th needle for your working needle. And you know, it is portable. You can take it with you. So, and floss is easy to take with you. So I can be knitting tubes that are 2.5 inches tall and be making pants for her, really. Now I have an extra loop in the back for some reason. And I'm going to try and get this bow as little as possible. Now, if I were going to make these into overalls, I would have put the drawstring toward the back, with the bow for the drawstring toward the back, and obviously I'll cut that and make it shorter and smaller. But they fit her. And the stitching is holding. So I think that's great. Now, like I said, if I were going to make overalls, I could even, because they're the same on front and back, I could even just turn them around. But I would pick up, there are 40 stitches, so folded in half there are 20 stitches. So I would leave 5 here. I would pick up 10 in the center and leave 5 on the other side, and knit a bib up to about here, so about 3/4 of an inch on those 10 stitches. And then to make straps, I would just I would end the yarn there, and then just pick up 2 stitches on each end and knit straps to go, they would be to the back. So they're a little baggy looking, but if we put her sweater back on, and once we get that bow smaller, with this size doll, a lot of times the clothes are going to be a little awkward. And if you look through that book I have of sewing their clothes, the reason I would do it mostly by hand is because of the woven fabrics letting go at the seams and stuff. So obviously I make the bow smaller, but there she is in a blue pair of pants and a sweater. And I can back up a little bit. I don't know where I put her doll stand. She looks like she has a pair of jeans on, which is exactly what I wanted. And now I'll be making her a top. And this will be another pattern that I add to my store. Because I think this will work. But see how that's spraying at the seam. That's where I cut it. Now I'll have to keep an eye on that and make sure that doesn't pull apart. But I can trim that and tuck it in a little bit. So there we go. Pants for a 4-inch Heidi Ott, or I'm sure they'd fit. I don't know if Townhouse Miniatures makes a 4-inch doll. They might. I have 6-inch dolls of theirs. So this is a 4-inch Heidi Ott.